The letter shook in Alina Whitfield's hand as the messenger rode away without another word. 3 years of silence, and now this single folded page had arrived at her door before sunrise, carried by a boy who refused to meet her eyes. She did not open it right away. She stood on the cold stone step of the vicarage, the wind pulling at her shawl, and she stared at the wax seal pressed into the paper. It was the seal of the house of Ashworth. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the whole village might hear it. She had written 312 letters to James Ashworth, 312 nights of sitting by candlelight, pouring her heart onto paper, sealing it, and sending it into a world that never answered back. She had stopped counting the days since his last reply. She had not stopped writing. Her fingers finally broke the seal. The paper was thick, expensive, nothing like the plain stationery she used. She unfolded it slowly, half afraid of what it might say, half afraid it might say nothing at all. The handwriting was not James's. It was sharp and formal, the hand of a clerk or a secretary. It read only one line. "The Duke requests your presence at Ashworth Hall before nightfall." Alina read it 3 times before she understood. James was not just returning. He was already home, and he wanted to see her immediately, not tomorrow, not next week, but before the sun went down that very day. She pressed the letter to her chest and ran back inside, calling for her mother, her voice breaking with a feeling she could not name. It was somewhere between joy and terror, between years of hope and the fear that hope had finally run out of road. To understand why a single sentence could undo a grown woman so completely, one must go back to a summer that felt like it would never end, to a girl of 19 who did not yet know that love could survive war, silence, and the cruelty of other people's plans. It began at the Harvest Festival, 3 years before that morning on the vicarage step. The village square was strung with lanterns, the air thick with the smell of baked apples and fresh hay. Alina had come with her father, the vicar, to help serve food to the workers who had spent the season in the fields. She was not looking for anything more than a pleasant evening among neighbors. Then a stranger on a tall gray horse rode into the square, and everything shifted. He was not dressed like the farmers and laborers around him. His coat was too fine, his boots too clean. He dismounted with an ease that suggested he had ridden horses his whole life, and he looked around the square with open curiosity, like a man seeing something new and delightful for the first time. Alina did not know yet that he was James Ashworth, heir to the Duke of Ashworth, the largest estate in the county. She only knew that he walked straight toward the table where she stood, picked up a slice of bread, and smiled at her as though they had already been friends for years. "You made this?" he asked, holding up the bread. "My mother did," Alina said. "I only carried it out here." "Then your mother is a genius, and you are a very capable assistant." Alina laughed before she could stop herself. There was something about his manner, easy and unguarded, that put her at ease immediately. She did not know his name, and for a moment she did not care. They talked for an hour that first night, standing near the edge of the square while the music played and the villagers danced. He told her he was visiting family land nearby. She told him about her father's church, about the books she loved, about her dream of one day seeing the sea, since she had lived her whole life inland and had never once smelled salt water. It was only when an older man in fine clothing approached and addressed him as "my lord" that Alina realized who she had been speaking with. Her stomach dropped. She stepped back, suddenly aware of the plain wool of her dress next to his tailored coat. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "Would it have changed anything you said to me?" James asked. "No," she admitted. "Then it does not matter," he said, and something in his voice told her he meant it. That summer became a season Alina would replay in her mind for years afterward. James found reasons to visit the village again and again. He claimed business with tenant farmers, errands for his father, anything that could explain why the future Duke kept appearing near the vicarage at hours that had nothing to do with business at all. They walked along the river that ran behind the church. They sat beneath the old oak tree where village children carved their initials. James told her about the weight of his family name, the expectations pressing on him from the moment he was born, the marriage his father had already been arranging in whispered conversations with other noble families before James had even finished his schooling. Eleanor told him about her own quiet fears, about being a vicar's daughter with no fortune and no title, about wondering if her life would always be small. "Nothing about you is small," James told her one evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and painted the sky orange. "I have met countesses and ladies from the finest houses in the country, and not one of them has made me feel the way an hour with you does." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. She only knew that her heart had made a decision long before her mind caught up to it. But summer does not last, and neither did peace. Word came in early autumn that war had broken out beyond the borders, a conflict that swallowed young men from every county, noble and common alike. James received his orders within weeks. As the heir of a great house, he could have found a way to avoid the front lines entirely. Many men of his station did exactly that, buying their way into safer postings or delaying their service through family influence. James refused. "My men will not respect a leader who hides while they bleed," he told Eleanor the night before he left. They stood beneath the same oak tree where they had spent so many evenings that summer. "I have to go, but I will come back, I promise you that." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "Promises made before danger are easy to make," she said. "It is the promises kept after that matter." "Then let me make you a different kind of promise," James said, taking her hands in his. "Write to me. Every letter you send I will read 100 times if I have to, wherever I am, whatever is happening around me. And I promise you this. No matter how long it takes, no matter what stands in my way, I will come back to this village and I will come back to you." "Every letter," Eleanor repeated, as though saying it aloud might make it more real, more binding. "Every single one," James said. He left before dawn the next morning. Eleanor stood at the edge of the village, watching his horse disappear over the hill, the last of the morning mist swallowing him whole. She did not cry until he was completely out of sight. Then she went home, found a piece of paper, and began the first of 312 letters that would define the next years of her life. She had no way of knowing, standing there with ink still wet on the page, that the road ahead would test every ounce of faith she had. She did not know about the silences that would stretch for months, about the family that would try to erase her from James's future entirely, or about the letter that would arrive claiming he was gone forever. She only knew in that raw and hopeful moment that she loved him, and that love felt like something worth waiting for, no matter the cost. That first letter was simple. She wrote about the village, about the harvest being brought in without him there to help carry the baskets, about the oak tree standing exactly where he had left it, waiting, the same way she now understood she would be waiting too. She folded the page, sealed it with a plain wax stamp, and walked it to the post herself rather than trusting anyone else with something so important. She did not know when or if it would reach him. She sent it anyway. 3 days later she wrote the second letter, then the third. She promised herself she would write once a week, but the promise did not survive her own heart. Some weeks she wrote 3 times, unable to stop the words from spilling out of her, needing somewhere to put the fear that crept in during quiet moments, the fear that came whenever she overheard the older villagers speaking in hushed tones about the war, about the young men who did not come home, about the letters that families received bearing news no one wanted to read. Her mother noticed the change in her daughter first. Eleanor, once quick to laugh and quicker to help with chores without complaint, now spent long hours at the small writing desk in her room, candle burning low, pen scratching against paper long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. "You cannot live your whole life waiting for a letter that may never come," her mother said gently one evening, setting down a cup of tea beside her daughter's elbow. "I am not waiting for a letter," Elinor said, without looking up from the page. "I am waiting for him. The letters simply help the time pass." Her mother said nothing more that night, though the worry did not leave her eyes. She had seen young women wait before, in wars long past, and she had seen how few of those stories ended the way the young women hoped. But Elinor was not interested in the odds. She was interested in a promise made beneath an old oak tree, and she intended to keep her half of it no matter how long James took to keep his. The village itself seemed to hold its breath that autumn. Every family had someone gone, a brother, a son, a husband, a sweetheart. The harvest festival that year was smaller, quieter, the lanterns fewer, the music softer. Elinor found herself standing near the same table where she had first met James, remembering the sound of his laugh, the way he had held up that piece of bread as though it were the finest meal he had ever tasted. She wrote about that memory in her fourth letter, hoping it might make him smile wherever he was, hoping the words could somehow cross whatever distance separated them and land gently in his hands. Weeks passed with no reply. Elinor told herself this was normal. Letters took time to cross such distances, especially in times of war, when roads were dangerous and messengers were scarce. She continued writing anyway, filling page after page with small details of home, with her hopes for his safety, with the quiet strength of a love that refused to waver simply because it received no answer in return. Then, just as the first frost settled over the fields, a letter arrived bearing James's own handwriting, and for the first time since he had ridden away, Elinor allowed herself to believe that everything might turn out exactly as he had promised. She tore it open with trembling hands, and there, in ink slightly smudged from travel, were the words she had been waiting for since the morning mist swallowed him whole. "My dearest Elinor," he had written, "your letters have reached me, every one of them, and I have read each by candlelight more times than I can count. I carry them folded against my chest, closer to my heart than my own uniform. This war is long and difficult, but knowing you are there, writing to me, waiting for me, gives me a reason to see tomorrow. Please keep writing. Your words are the only peace I know here." Elinor read the letter until the ink nearly blurred from her tears, though these were not tears of sorrow. She pressed the page to her chest, exactly as he had described doing with hers, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile without effort. She did not know that this single reply would be one of very few. She did not know how long the silence after it would stretch, or what would happen when the letters stopped coming entirely, and the village began to whisper that the young lord who once danced at the harvest festival might never return home at all. But that evening, with his letter pressed against her heart, Elinor believed that love, once given so fully, could survive anything. She believed that no war, no distance, and no silence could break a promise made beneath an old oak tree. She was young enough to believe it completely, and brave enough to keep writing no matter what came next. She sat down that very night and began her fifth letter, unaware that 297 more would follow before she would finally see his face again. The winter that followed was the coldest the village had seen in years, and it was also the winter that Elinor learned how cruel silence could be. James's letters, once arriving every few weeks, began to slow. A letter would come, full of warmth and detail about the places he had seen, the men he served beside, the small comforts he found in her words. Then nothing would arrive for a month. Then two. Elinor did not stop writing. If anything, the silences made her write more, as though the sheer number of letters she sent could somehow force one of James's replies to find its way back to her sooner. She wrote about the frost patterns on her window in the mornings. She wrote about her father's sermons, about the sheep that had wandered into the churchyard and refused to leave until someone brought them bread. She wrote about nothing important at all, because she had learned that it was not the news inside the letters that mattered most. It was the proof that she was still there, still thinking of him, still keeping her half of the promise. By the time the letter arrived announcing that James had been given a period of leave to return home for a short visit, Alina had written 74 letters. She counted them herself, keeping a careful list in the back of her journal, because counting gave her something to hold onto during the long stretches when no reply came at all. The day he was due to arrive, the entire village seemed to know it before Alina did. Word traveled fast in a place so small, and the return of the future Duke, even briefly, was not the kind of news that stayed quiet for long. Alina spent the morning trying to focus on her usual chores, helping her mother in the kitchen, tending the small garden behind the vicarage, but her hands kept forgetting what they were doing. Her mind was entirely on the road that led into the village, waiting for the sound of hooves. When James finally appeared, riding the same gray horse he had ridden away on, Alina was standing exactly where she had stood the morning he left, beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the village. She did not run to him. She simply stood, watching him dismount, watching him walk toward her with the same easy confidence she remembered from that first harvest festival, though something in his eyes had changed. There was a weight there now, something the war had placed behind his gaze that had not been there before. "You kept your promise," she said, when he was close enough to hear her without her needing to raise her voice. "I told you I would," James answered. "Though I confess, some days it was your promise that kept me going more than my own." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather satchel, worn soft from months of travel. Inside were her letters, every single one she had sent, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent, the paper soft as cloth in places. "You kept them all," Alina whispered. "I could not bear to lose a single word you wrote to me," James said. "There were nights I read the same letter 3 or 4 times simply because I could not sleep, and your voice, even on paper, was the only thing that quieted my mind." Alina's leave with James lasted only 9 days, but those 9 days became some of the most precious of her life. They walked the same paths they had walked the summer before. They sat beneath the oak tree until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing, about the future they both hoped for but neither dared to name too clearly, as though naming it might somehow put it at risk. On the 7th evening of his visit, as they sat together watching the last light fade from the sky, James took her hand and grew quiet in a way that made Alina's heart quicken with nerves. "When this war ends," he said slowly, "I intend to speak with my father. I intend to tell him that I have chosen who I wish to marry, and that choice has nothing to do with title or fortune or the arrangements he has already been making without my consent." Alina's breath caught. "James, your father has already promised you to another family. I have heard the villagers speak of it. Lady Beatrice Hargrove, daughter of the Earl of Camden. Everyone says the match has been settled since you were children." "Nothing is settled until I say it is settled," James said firmly. "I am the one who must live this life, not my father, and I cannot imagine living any version of it without you in it." Alina wanted desperately to believe him. She wanted to trust that love alone could overcome the weight of family expectation, the pressure of title and inheritance and generations of tradition that valued advantageous marriages over matters of the heart. But she had grown up watching how such things worked in the world beyond the vicarage, and she knew that promises made in quiet evenings under an oak tree did not always survive contact with drawing rooms full of powerful men making decisions over polished tables. Still, she chose to believe him, because the alternative, doubting him completely, felt like a betrayal of everything she had already given to this love. His leave ended too quickly. On the morning he was due to depart again, Alina walked with him to the edge of the village, the same place where she had watched him disappear once before. This time, before he mounted his horse, he took both of her hands in his and looked at her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away. 300 letters, he said. "That is what I want from you before I return again. Write me 300 letters, and by the time you have sent the last one, I promise you, I will be standing here to receive it myself, not as a soldier passing through, but as a man free to make his own choice about the rest of his life." 300 letters, Alina repeated, and something about the specific number, the audacity of it, made her laugh despite the ache building in her chest. That is a great many letters, James Ashworth. Then you had better start writing quickly, he said, smiling in that same easy way that had first caught her attention at the harvest festival so long ago. He kissed her hand gently, mounted his horse, and rode away once more, leaving Alina standing beneath the oak tree with a promise so large it frightened her even as it filled her with hope. She began that very afternoon, writing letter number 75 before the sun had fully set. She wrote about his visit, about the way the village had lit up simply from having him near, about the ache of watching him leave again so soon after finally having him close. The letters that followed over the coming months carried a different quality than those written before his visit. Now Alina was not simply writing into uncertainty, hoping her words might reach someone far away. She was writing toward a specific goal, a number, a promise with an actual shape to it. 300 letters felt like a mountain to climb, but for the first time, Alina could see the peak, however distant it seemed. She wrote to him about the changing seasons, about spring finally arriving and pushing green shoots up through soil that had been frozen for so long. She wrote about her father falling ill briefly with a winter cough that worried the whole family until he recovered fully by early spring. She wrote about her friend Charlotte, who had begun courting a young farmer from the neighboring village, and how strange it felt to watch someone else's love story unfold so simply while her own remained suspended across such distance. James's replies came more steadily during this period, though never as often as Alina might have wished. He wrote about the places his regiment traveled through, careful never to reveal details that might endanger his position or worry her more than necessary. He wrote about the friendships he had formed among the other soldiers, about a young corporal named Edwin who had become something like a brother to him, about the small kindnesses that helped men survive circumstances that tested every part of their character. He also wrote in nearly every letter about his father. The Duke of Ashworth, it seemed, had not softened in his determination to see James married to Lady Beatrice Hargrove. If anything, the ongoing war seemed to increase his urgency, as though he feared that delaying the arrangement any further might result in losing the opportunity entirely, whether through James's death on some distant battlefield or through some other complication the Duke had not yet imagined. Letters arrived at James's post with increasing frequency, urging him to consider his duty to the family name, reminding him of promises made between the two noble houses years before James had ever met Alina Whitfield. "I have not yet found the courage to tell him about you," James admitted in one letter, sent nearly a year after his brief leave. "Not because I am ashamed, but because I know the storm it will bring, and I want to face that storm at your side, not from a battlefield thousands of miles away where I cannot protect you from whatever consequences follow." Alina understood his reasoning, even as it left a small ache in her chest, a quiet fear that perhaps some part of him was not yet ready to fully commit to the life he had promised her beneath the oak tree. She pushed the fear aside as best she could, and kept writing, kept counting, kept believing that 300 letters would somehow prove strong enough to hold their promise together across whatever distance and difficulty still lay ahead. By the time autumn arrived again, bringing with it the second harvest festival since James had first ridden into the village square, Alina had written 180 letters. She stood again near the table where her mother's bread was served, remembering the exact spot where a stranger on a gray horse had first smiled at her, as though they had already been friends for years. The lanterns were brighter that year, the mood in the village slightly lifted by news that the war, while still ongoing, seemed to be shifting in favor of an eventual peace. Alina allowed herself, for the first time in many months, to imagine what her life might look like once the letters finally stopped, once distance was no longer the primary language of her relationship with James. She imagined a wedding in the small village church her father presided over. She imagined James no longer as a soldier or a duke's heir, but simply as a husband, sitting beside her at their own table, sharing meals that did not need to be described in letters because he would already be there to taste them himself. She did not yet know that the road to that imagined future still held its darkest stretch ahead of her, a stretch that would test not just her patience, but her very faith that James was still alive at all. She did not know that within a matter of months, the steady rhythm of his letters would stop entirely, replaced by a silence so complete and so prolonged that even her unwavering hope would begin, for the first time, to crack. That evening, walking home from the harvest festival with lantern light flickering behind her, Alina felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long while. She felt certain that love, patience, and 300 letters would be enough. She had no way of knowing how badly that certainty was about to be tested, or how close she would come to believing, against every instinct in her heart, that James Ashworth might never come home to her at all. The silence began in early winter, so gradually at first that Alina did not notice it as anything unusual. James's letters had always arrived unevenly, sometimes two in a single week, sometimes nothing for a month. She had learned to expect the gaps and not to read too much fear into them. But as the weeks stretched into a full month, then two, a small knot began to form in her stomach that would not loosen no matter how she tried to reason it away. She kept writing. Letter 199 arrived at the post office on a gray morning in December, carried there by Alina herself despite the biting cold, because she trusted no one else with the task. She told herself that James was simply moved to a new location, that the war made regular communication difficult, that soldiers everywhere experienced these silences and somehow found their way back to their loved ones eventually. Her mother watched her daughter's growing worry with quiet concern. Margaret Whitfield had lived long enough to recognize the particular kind of waiting that hollowed out a person from the inside, and she tried, gently, to prepare Alina for outcomes she did not want to imagine. "You must understand, my dear," she said one evening as they sat together mending clothes by the fire, "that war does not always end the way we hope. I am not saying this to discourage you. I am saying it because I love you, and I do not want you shattered by something you refuse to consider possible." "I have considered it," Alina said quietly, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "I consider it every single night before I fall asleep, but considering something is possible is not the same as believing it is true. Until I have proof otherwise, I choose to believe he is alive and that he will come home." Her mother said nothing more, though she reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, a small gesture that carried more comfort than words could have offered. January brought no letters. February brought none either. By March, the knot in Alina's stomach had become a near-constant companion, and the village, sensing her distress, began to treat her with the particular gentleness reserved for those waiting on news from the front. Neighbors who once asked cheerfully whether she had heard from young Lord Ashworth now simply offered sympathetic smiles and changed the subject. As though avoiding the question might somehow protect her from an answer, none of them wanted to give voice to. Alina reached letter 230 in April, still writing weekly, though the letters themselves had changed in tone. Where once she filled pages with cheerful details of village life, her words now carried an undercurrent of desperate hope, as though sheer persistence might somehow reach across whatever silence separated them and pull James back toward her through the strength of her devotion alone. "I do not know if these letters reach you anymore," she wrote in one particularly difficult entry. "I do not know if you are somewhere reading them by candlelight as you once described, or if they simply gather in some post office far from here, waiting for a recipient who may never come to claim them. But I will keep writing, James, because stopping feels like giving up on you, and I refuse to do that. I refuse." It was in May, nearly 6 months after his last letter, that the news finally arrived, though it was not the news Alina had been praying for. A carriage bearing the Ashworth family crest pulled up outside the vicarage on a warm spring afternoon, and Alina's heart leapt with sudden, foolish hope the moment she saw it through the window. Perhaps James had returned. Perhaps he had come himself to explain the long silence, to apologize for the worry he had caused, to finally make good on every promise whispered beneath the old oak tree. But it was not James who stepped down from the carriage. It was an older man Alina did not recognize, dressed in the formal black of someone delivering solemn news, accompanied by a younger woman whose face was pale and drawn with an emotion Alina could not immediately place. "Miss Whitfield?" the older man asked, removing his hat as he approached the door. "Yes," Alina answered, her voice already trembling, some instinct within her recognizing the shape of the moment even before the words arrived to confirm it. "I am Colonel Ashford, formerly of Lord Ashworth's regiment," the man said. "This is Lady Beatrice Hargrove. We have traveled from Ashworth Hall to speak with you directly, as we understood from the Duke's household that you had been in regular correspondence with young Lord James." Alina's hand found the doorframe, gripping it for support. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please tell me what has happened." Colonel Ashford's expression softened with genuine sympathy, though his words, when they came, felt like ice water poured directly over Alina's heart. Lord James was reported missing following an engagement in early winter. Despite extensive searching, no trace of him has been found in the months since. The Duke has, with great sorrow, begun to accept that his son may not have survived. The world seemed to tilt beneath Alina's feet. She heard her mother's footsteps rushing from inside the house, felt Margaret's arms wrap around her before she fully understood that her knees had buckled. She heard herself asking questions that did not seem to come from her own voice, asking about the search efforts, about whether a body had been recovered, about whether missing truly meant what everyone standing before her seemed to believe it meant. "There is no confirmation of his death," Colonel Ashford said carefully, "but neither is there confirmation of his survival. The Duke felt it only right that you be informed, given the frequency of your correspondence, which his household staff had noted over these past years." It was Lady Beatrice who spoke next, and her words, though gentler in tone, cut Alina just as deeply. "I am truly sorry for your grief, Miss Whitfield. I understand you cared for him. I cared for him too, in my own way, though our arrangement was always one of family duty rather than personal affection. I wanted you to hear this from someone who understood, at least in part, what it means to lose the future you had imagined for yourself." Alina could not find words to respond. She simply nodded, tears streaming freely down her face, as her mother guided her back inside the house, and the carriage eventually pulled away, leaving the vicarage wrapped in a silence far heavier than any that had come before. For 3 days, Alina did not write. It was the longest gap in her letters since she had begun the practice nearly 2 years before. She sat in her room, staring at the stack of pages already written, at the careful count marked in her journal, 231 letters sent into a void that might now, truly, never send anything back. Her father, the vicar, came to sit with her on the 3rd evening, finding her not crying but simply staring at the blank page before her, pen resting untouched beside it. "They said missing, not dead," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her desk. "In my years counseling families through this war, I have learned that missing carries within it a thread of possibility that dead does not. I am not telling you to abandon caution, Alina. I am telling you that hope, even fragile hope, is not the same as foolishness." "Everyone believes he is gone," Alina said quietly. "The Duke believes it. Colonel Ashford believes it. Even Lady Beatrice, who was meant to marry him, believes it enough to come here and offer her condolences as though the matter were already settled." "And what do you believe?" her father asked. Alina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window, toward the direction of the old oak tree standing at the edge of the village, the same tree beneath which James had made his final promise before riding away the second time. "I believe," she said slowly, "that if he were truly gone I would feel it. Some part of me would know, the same way I knew the moment I saw him at the harvest festival, that my life was about to change. I do not feel that emptiness. I feel his absence, yes, painfully so, but I do not feel that he is gone." Her father did not argue with her, though Alina could see in his eyes that he worried her heart might be leading her toward a disappointment too large to survive. Still, he did not try to convince her otherwise. He simply nodded, patted her hand, and left her alone with the blank page still waiting on her desk. That night, Alina picked up her pen and wrote letter number 232, though she had no address to send it to, no post that would carry it toward any known destination. She wrote it anyway, sealed it, and placed it in the growing stack of letters she kept in a wooden box beneath her bed, a stack that had begun, in her mind, to feel less like correspondence and more like a vigil. The months that followed tested every fiber of Alina's resolve. The village, once so full of gentle sympathy, gradually shifted toward a quieter kind of pity, the sort reserved for those who continued waiting long after most people believed waiting had become pointless. Charlotte, her closest friend, married her young farmer that summer, and though Alina attended the wedding and smiled through every toast, she felt the particular ache of watching someone else's story reach its happy conclusion, while her own remained suspended in painful uncertainty. Suitors began to appear at the vicarage with increasing frequency, young men from neighboring villages who had heard, through the endless channels of local gossip, that the vicar's daughter, who once loved a duke's heir, might now be available for courtship, given the sad turn her circumstances had taken. Alina turned each of them away politely but firmly, though the persistence of one young man in particular, a wealthy merchant's son named Edmund Fairweather, tested her patience more than the others. "You cannot spend your entire life waiting for a ghost, Miss Whitfield," Edmund said to her one afternoon, having called upon the vicarage uninvited for the third time that month. "I mean no disrespect to Lord Ashworth's memory, but a woman as remarkable as yourself deserves a life, not merely a memory to mourn." "He is not a memory," Alina said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones over the preceding months. "He is missing, not confirmed dead, and until someone provides me with proof of his passing, I will continue to believe in his return, regardless of how foolish that belief may appear to those around me." Edmund did not return after that conversation, though Alina suspected her firm words had done less to discourage him than simple boredom eventually would. She continued writing, letter after letter, even without any confirmation that James remained alive to receive them. By autumn, the stack beneath her bed had grown to include letters 232 through 270. Each one a small act of defiance against a grief the world seemed determined to make her accept before she was ready. It was in late October, nearly a full year after James's last confirmed letter, that a piece of news finally arrived that shifted everything once again. It came not from Ashworth Hall, not from Colonel Ashford or any official channel, but from a wounded soldier passing through the village on his way home to a neighboring county, a young man named Frederick who had served briefly, alongside a regiment that included survivors from James's original company. Frederick sought out the vicarage specifically, having heard from a fellow traveler that Miss Whitfield had been corresponding with Lord James Ashworth before his disappearance. He arrived leaning heavily on a cane, his uniform worn and his face marked with the particular weariness of a man who had seen far more than any young person should. "I do not know if this news will bring you comfort or further pain," Frederick said carefully, once Alina had welcomed him inside and offered him tea. "But I served briefly with men who knew Lord Ashworth. There were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that he survived his injuries and was recovering in a field hospital some distance from where he was originally reported missing. Communication from that particular hospital has been notoriously unreliable, given how far it sits from the main supply lines." Alina's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to tremble. "You believe he is alive?" "I cannot promise you certainty," Frederick admitted. "Rumors in wartime are as common as they are unreliable, but I felt you deserved to hear even uncertain hope rather than none at all." That night, for the first time in nearly a year, Alina slept without the crushing weight of despair pressing against her chest. She did not yet know that Frederick's rumor, though rooted in truth, told only a fraction of the full story, that James had indeed survived his injuries, but that his path back to her would prove far more complicated than a simple recovery and return. She could not have known that James, even as he began to regain his strength in a hospital tent far from home, was already facing a battle of an entirely different kind, one fought not with weapons but with family loyalty, inherited duty, and a father determined to see his son married according to plan, regardless of whatever promises had been whispered beneath an old oak tree. Alina wrote letter number 271 that night with a trembling hand and a heart cautiously, painfully, beginning to hope again. She had no way of knowing that dozens more letters would need to be written before she would finally learn the truth of what had kept James away so long, or that the true obstacle standing between them was no longer war, but the very family he had been born into. James Ashworth woke in a field hospital with no memory of how many days had passed since the explosion that had thrown him from his horse and buried him briefly beneath fallen timber and scorched earth. A nurse named Alice, kind but overworked, told him he had been unconscious for nearly 2 weeks and that his recovery, while steady, would take many more months before he could be considered fit to travel home. His first coherent thought, once his mind cleared enough to form one, was of Alina. He asked immediately whether any letters had arrived for him, whether word had been sent to his family confirming his survival, whether anyone had informed the young woman waiting for him in a small village he had not seen in nearly a year. The answers he received were not encouraging. The field hospital sat far from the main communication lines, isolated by both distance and the ongoing dangers of the surrounding countryside. Messages in and out were sporadic at best, often delayed by weeks or lost entirely. James spent his early days of recovery consumed by frustration, desperate to send word to Alina that he was alive, that her 300 letters had not been written into an empty void, that he was coming back to her exactly as he had promised. It took nearly 2 months before James was strong enough to travel, and even then, his journey home was slower than he wished, hampered by his still-healing injuries and the general chaos of a countryside recovering from prolonged conflict. He wrote to Alina the moment he was able, a hurried letter explaining his survival, his injuries, his desperate hope that she had not given up on him during the long silence. That letter, like several others he sent during his recovery, never reached the vicarage. The postal routes remained unreliable for months after the fighting officially ended, and James had no way of knowing that his words, meant to end Alina's suffering, were instead lost somewhere along a road that no longer existed in any recognizable form. When James finally arrived back on English soil, thinner than before and moving with a slight limp that would fade only slowly over time, he expected to travel directly to the village, to Alina, to the oak tree where he had made his final promise. Instead, he found himself intercepted at the docks by his father's own carriage, sent specifically to bring him straight to Ashworth Hall before he could go anywhere else. The Duke of Ashworth, a formidable man named Edmund Ashworth, embraced his son with genuine relief upon his arrival, tears in his eyes that surprised James, given how rarely he had witnessed his father display such open emotion. But the relief in the Duke's expression shifted quickly to something more calculated once the initial embrace ended. "You must rest," the Duke said, guiding James into the grand hall of the estate. "You must recover fully before you concern yourself with anything else. There will be time enough for village visits once you are properly settled back into your role here." James, still weak from his journey and grateful simply to be standing on familiar ground again, allowed himself to be led toward the guest quarters that had been prepared for his convalescence. He did not yet understand that his father's insistence on rest was not merely concern for his health, but the opening move in a much larger effort to keep James distracted, occupied, and separated from the village, and the young woman waiting there for as long as possible. Over the following weeks, James found himself surrounded by a constant stream of visitors, family friends, business associates, and members of the extended Ashworth household, all eager to welcome him home, and not so subtly, to remind him of his responsibilities as heir to the dukedom. Lady Beatrice Hargrove herself called upon the estate within the first week of his return, her relief at his survival appearing genuine, though James could sense, even through his exhaustion, that something had shifted in her manner since he had last seen her. "I am glad you are alive," Beatrice told him plainly, during a private moment in the estate gardens. "Truly glad, James. But I must tell you, your father has spoken to me at length about our arrangement, and he has made it clear he expects the engagement to proceed as originally planned, particularly given how close the world came to losing you entirely." "Beatrice," James said carefully, "I have never given you false hope regarding our arrangement. I have always been honest that my heart belongs elsewhere." "I know," Beatrice said, her voice carrying more sadness than resentment, "and I have always respected that honesty, even as it complicates matters considerably. But your father is not a man easily dissuaded once he has settled on a course, James. You know this better than anyone." James did know it. He had known it his entire life, watching his father shape the family's fortunes through careful, sometimes ruthless calculation, valuing strategic alliances above nearly everything else, including, James had begun to fear, his own son's happiness. The confrontation James had been dreading finally arrived on a quiet evening nearly a month after his return, when his father summoned him to the study for what was described simply as an important conversation. "I have heard," the Duke began, once James had settled into the chair across from his father's desk, "that during your time recovering, before I sent the carriage to collect you, you attempted to send correspondence to a young woman in the village near our southern properties. A vicar's daughter, I am told." James's stomach tightened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Eleanor Whitfield, yes, father. We have corresponded for nearly 3 years." "3 years," the Duke repeated, his tone carrying a weight that made the words sound almost accusatory. 3 years of correspondence with a woman entirely unsuitable for a future duke, kept secret from your own family. While an arrangement with the Hargrove family, one that has been in careful negotiation since before you were old enough to understand its importance, sat waiting in the background. "I never agreed to the arrangement with the Hargroves," James said, his voice steady despite the anger building beneath his calm exterior. "You made that arrangement. I have simply allowed it to exist without directly refusing it, out of respect for you and for Lady Beatrice, while I sorted through my own heart during a war that nearly cost me my life entirely." "Your heart," the Duke said almost dismissively. "James, do you understand what is at stake here? This family's future depends on strategic alliances on land, on connections that secure our position for generations to come. A vicar's daughter, however charming she may be, brings nothing to this family beyond whatever affection you feel for her personally. Affection fades, James. Strategic advantage does not." "With respect, father," James said, standing now, unable to remain seated any longer, "I disagree entirely. I nearly died in a field far from home, and the only thing that kept me fighting to survive, the only thing that gave me a reason to endure months of pain and uncertainty, was the thought of returning to Eleanor. Not to this estate, not to strategic advantage, to her." The Duke's expression hardened, and for a long moment the study fell into tense silence, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace between them. "I will not force you to marry Lady Beatrice against your explicit refusal," the Duke finally said. "I am not a monster, whatever you may think of me in this moment. But understand clearly, James, that choosing this vicar's daughter over the arrangement I have spent years cultivating will carry consequences. I will not simply hand over the full weight of this family's inheritance to a union I consider beneath our name. You will need to prove, quite thoroughly, that this choice is one you are willing to sacrifice for, not simply a romantic notion born from wartime desperation. James left the study that night with his father's warning heavy in his chest, but also with a clarity he had not felt since before the war began. He understood, perhaps for the first time completely, exactly what he wanted from the rest of his life, and it was not the strategic advantage his father valued so highly. It was a leaner, and the simple, uncomplicated love they had built together beneath an old oak tree, far from the calculations of noble houses and inherited titles. Still, extracting himself fully from his father's expectations proved more complicated than a single conversation could resolve. The Duke, though he had promised not to force the marriage, employed every other tool at his disposal to delay James's return to the village. A state business that had piled up during James's absence required his attention. Legal matters concerning his eventual inheritance needed careful review. Social obligations, dinners and gatherings meant to reintroduce him properly to society after his long absence, filled his calendar with an efficiency that left little room for personal errands. James endured it all with growing impatience, writing to Alina whenever he found a spare moment, though he had no way of confirming whether any of these new letters were reaching her any more successfully than his earlier attempts had. He did not yet know about the devastating news that had reached the vicarage the previous spring, about Colonel Ashford's visit, about the months Alina had spent believing him dead before Frederick's uncertain rumor had restored even a fragment of her hope. It was nearly 2 months after his return to Ashworth Hall, following countless delayed departures and manufactured obligations, that James finally reached the limit of his patience entirely. He confronted his father once more, this time with a directness that left no room for further delay. "I am going to the village tomorrow morning," James announced, standing firmly in the doorway of his father's study. "Not next week. Not after the Hargrove dinner you have scheduled, or the meeting with the estate solicitors, or any other obligation you have arranged to keep me occupied. Tomorrow morning, Father. I have honored your requests for 2 months, and I will honor them no longer." The Duke studied his son for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that James could not entirely read, some combination of frustration, and perhaps grudging respect for the resolve his son was finally displaying. "Very well," the Duke said finally. "But understand, James, that if you proceed down this path, formally ending the arrangement with the Hargrove family and pursuing this vicar's daughter instead, you do so with full awareness of the consequences I have already outlined. This family's expectations of you will not simply disappear because your heart has chosen a different direction." "I understand completely," James said, "and I accept whatever consequences follow. I have spent long enough letting fear of your disapproval keep me from the one thing that has never wavered throughout this entire ordeal. Alina's letters never stopped coming, Father, not through months of silence, not even, I suspect, through news that I might be dead. That kind of devotion deserves more than delay and calculation. It deserves everything I have to give." That night, James wrote his final letter to Lady Beatrice, formally and respectfully ending their arranged engagement, thanking her for her honesty and patience throughout an arrangement neither of them had ever truly desired for themselves. He then sat awake long into the night, gathering the leather satchel containing every letter Alina had ever sent him, preparing himself for the journey he had waited nearly a year to make. He had no way of knowing, as he finally drifted into restless sleep, exactly what awaited him in the village the following day, or how deeply his prolonged absence had tested the faith of the woman who had written him letter after letter, month after month, never once knowing whether any of them would ever find their way into his hands again. The morning after James's confrontation with his father, a rider was sent ahead to the vicarage carrying a single line written in the hand of the Duke's own secretary, a formal request that Alina present herself at Ashworth Hall before nightfall. James had insisted on writing the message himself, wanting his own voice to reach her first, but his father had overruled him at the final moment, arguing that a formal summons through proper channels would draw less unwanted attention from village gossip than a personal letter might. James had reluctantly agreed, eager simply to see the message sent, unaware of how much fear and confusion those few formal words would stir in Alina before he could explain himself in person. Alina spent the hours after receiving the message in a state of near constant motion, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything beyond the overwhelming uncertainty of what awaited her. Her mother helped her dress in her finest gown, a soft blue dress that Alina had not worn since the last harvest festival before the war had truly separated her from James for so long. "It could mean anything," Alina said, as her mother fastened the final buttons along her back. "It could mean he has returned and wishes to see me. It could mean the family wishes to inform me of something else entirely, something I am not prepared to hear." "Then you will face it, whatever it is," her mother said gently, turning Alina to face her directly. "You have faced every difficult moment of these past years with more courage than most grown men I have known. You will face this one too." The carriage that arrived to collect Alina was grander than any she had ridden in before, and the journey to Ashworth Hall, though not particularly long in distance, felt to Alina like it stretched across an impossible span of time. She watched the countryside pass by the window, her mind cycling endlessly through every possible reason she might have been summoned, unable to settle on any single explanation that felt certain enough to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Ashworth Hall itself was more imposing than Alina had imagined, even after years of hearing James describe it during their conversations beneath the oak tree. Stone towers rose against the darkening sky, and rows of tall windows glowed with candlelight as the carriage pulled up along the long gravel drive. A footman helped her down from the carriage and led her toward the grand entrance, where another servant waited to guide her deeper into the house. Alina's hands trembled as she walked through corridors lined with portraits of Ashworth ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with silent, judging curiosity. She was led, finally, to a set of tall wooden doors that opened into what appeared to be a formal receiving room, elegant and imposing, with a fireplace crackling at one end, and tall windows overlooking gardens now cast in shadow as evening settled fully over the estate. The room was empty when she entered, and for a moment, panic gripped her chest as she wondered if she had been brought here for some purpose entirely unrelated to James, some formal dismissal or difficult conversation she was not prepared to face alone. Then a door on the opposite side of the room opened, and James Ashworth stepped through it. He looked different than the young man who had ridden away beneath a canopy of morning mist so long ago, and different too from the soldier who had returned briefly on leave, bringing with him her first 74 letters folded soft with rereading. He moved with a slight limp that had not been there before, evidence of injuries Alina knew nothing about, and there was a leanness to his frame that spoke of hardships she could only imagine. But his eyes, when they found hers across the room, held the exact same warmth she remembered from that very first evening at the harvest festival, when he had held up a piece of bread and smiled at her as though they had already been friends for years. "Alina," he said, and her name in his voice after so long nearly undid her completely. "You're alive," Alina whispered, unable to move, unable to trust that the figure standing before her was truly real and not some cruel trick of exhaustion and desperate hope. "They told me you were missing. They told me you might be gone forever." "I know," James said, crossing the room toward her slowly, favoring his injured leg slightly with each step. "I know, and I am so deeply sorry for every moment of pain that silence caused you. I wrote to you the moment I was strong enough, Alina, but the letters never reached the village. The roads were destroyed, the postal routes in chaos for months after the fighting ended. I did not learn until I returned to Ashworth Hall just how completely my silence must have devastated you." "I kept writing anyway," Alina said, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. "Even after they told me you might be dead, I kept writing because some part of me refused to believe it, refused to accept that a love as strong as what we built together could simply end without me knowing for certain." James reached her then, close enough to take both her hands in his, exactly as he had done beneath the oak tree the morning of his final departure. 300 letters, he said softly. "That is what I asked of you, and you gave me so much more. 312, Alina. I have counted every single one because I have received them all, every letter you ever wrote to me, even the ones that took months to catch up with my changing location during the war." He reached into his coat and withdrew the same worn leather satchel Alina remembered from his brief leave years before, though now it bulged considerably larger, stuffed full of papers soft with handling, edges worn from constant folding and unfolding. "Every single one is here," James said. "I read them during the worst nights of the war, when I was not certain I would survive to see morning. I read them during my recovery, when the pain of my injuries felt unbearable. Your words carried me through every darkness I faced, Alina. You have no idea how many times these pages, and the love written across them, kept me fighting to stay alive simply so I could return and tell you in person exactly what they meant to me." Alina's tears came freely now, though they carried none of the sorrow that had marked so much of the previous year. "Why did it take so long for you to come to me, once you were finally home? Why the formal summons, the strange messenger, the fear I felt not knowing what awaited me here tonight?" James's expression grew more serious, though he did not release her hands. "My father tried, in every way available to him, to keep me occupied and delayed, hoping perhaps that time and distraction might change my mind about the arrangement he had planned for me since childhood. I allowed myself to be delayed longer than I should have, out of some misguided sense of duty to a family expectation I never truly wanted for myself. That delay was a mistake, Alina, and I regret every day it cost us. But I want you to know that today, I ended it completely. I have formally released myself from any obligation to Lady Beatrice Hargrove. I have told my father, in no uncertain terms, that my future belongs with you, regardless of whatever consequences that choice might bring to my inheritance or my standing within this family." Before Alina could respond, the door on the far side of the room opened again, and the Duke of Ashworth himself entered, his expression unreadable as he observed his son standing hand in hand with the vicar's daughter he had spent years trying to keep separated from the family's future. Alina instinctively stepped back, suddenly aware of how small and out of place she must appear within this grand receiving room, standing before a man whose disapproval could shape the entire course of her future with James. But James did not release her hand. If anything, his grip tightened, a silent reassurance that he had no intention of letting his father's presence diminish the choice he had already made. "Miss Whitfield," the Duke said, his voice formal but not unkind, "I understand you have waited a considerable time for my son's return." 3 years, Your Grace," Alina said, finding a steadiness in her voice that surprised even herself. 312 letters, to be precise. Something shifted in the Duke's expression at those words, a flicker of genuine surprise, perhaps even reluctant respect. 312, he repeated slowly. "My son mentioned this number to me earlier today, though I confess I did not fully appreciate its significance until this moment. That is a considerable testament to devotion, Miss Whitfield, particularly given how little certainty you had that any of those letters would ever be read, let alone answered." "I did not write them expecting certainty, Your Grace," Alina said. "I wrote them because I loved your son, and because he asked me to trust that love enough to keep writing regardless of what obstacles stood between us. I could not have imagined, when I began, everything that would stand in our way. But I do not regret a single letter, even the ones written during the months I believed him lost to me forever." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying Alina with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze steadily. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that suggested careful, considered thought rather than the dismissive judgment Alina had feared. I have spent my entire life believing that strategic alliance and family duty must take precedence over matters of personal affection, the Duke said. It is how I was raised, and it is the framework through which I have tried to guide my son's future. But I confess, Miss Whitfield, that a devotion capable of surviving 3 years of war, prolonged silence, and false reports of death is not something easily dismissed as mere youthful sentiment. My son nearly died believing in a promise made to you. He has told me quite clearly that your letters gave him the will to survive when survival seemed nearly impossible. That is not a small thing. That is not something I can, in good conscience, continue to stand against. Alina felt James's hand tighten around hers once more, and when she glanced toward him, she found him watching his father with an expression of cautious hope, as though he too had not fully expected this shift in tone. "I'm not offering my full blessing without reservation," the Duke continued, "for there remain practical matters to discuss, adjustments this family will need to make, expectations that will require careful navigation in the months ahead. But I will not stand as an obstacle between you and my son any longer, Miss Whitfield. Not after witnessing, firsthand, the depth of what you have both endured to reach this moment." The relief that flooded through Alina was almost overwhelming, and she felt James release a breath beside her that suggested he had been holding it since long before his father entered the room. The Duke offered a final, formal nod before excusing himself, leaving James and Alina alone once more in the firelit receiving room. "I did not expect that," James admitted, once the door had closed behind his father. "I expected resistance, perhaps even outright refusal. I did not expect him to soften so quickly." "Perhaps," Alina said softly, 312 letters carry more weight than either of us realized." James smiled then, the same easy, unguarded smile that had first caught her attention at the Harvest Festival so many years before. He reached into his coat once more, and this time withdrew not letters, but a small velvet box that he opened carefully before her, revealing a simple ring, elegant but understated, nothing like the elaborate jewelry Alina might have expected from a family of such wealth and standing. "I had this made during my recovery," James said, "long before I knew whether my father would ever accept our future together. I wanted something that reflected you, Alina, something simple and enduring, rather than something showy meant to impress others who could never understand what we have built between us." He knelt before her then, despite the discomfort it clearly caused his still healing leg, and looked up at her with an earnestness that made Alina's remaining doubts dissolve completely. "Alina Whitfield," James said, "you wrote me 312 letters across years of war, silence, and uncertainty, never once knowing for certain whether I would live to read them or return to answer your devotion in person. I cannot promise you a life free of difficulty, for I know now how unpredictable this world can be. But I can promise you that I will spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of the faith you placed in me during those long years of waiting. Will you marry me?" Alina's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, James, 1,000 times yes." Word of their engagement spread through the village within days, carried by the same efficient channels of gossip that had once whispered sympathetically about a young woman waiting for a man many believed dead. Now those same voices carried a different kind of story entirely, one of devotion rewarded, of promises kept despite every obstacle placed before them. The wedding took place the following spring, in the same small church where Alina's father had presided over sermons her entire life. The village turned out in full, filling the pews and spilling out into the churchyard, eager to witness the culmination of a love story that had become, over the preceding years, something of a local legend. Charlotte stood beside Alina as she prepared for the ceremony, helping arrange the final details of her dress, while Alina's mother wept happy tears from the front pew, remembering all the long nights she had watched her daughter write letters by candlelight, never certain whether her devotion would ultimately be rewarded. As Alina walked down the aisle toward James, who stood waiting with the same warm smile that had first captured her heart years before, she found herself thinking of that very first harvest festival, of a stranger on a gray horse who had picked up a piece of bread and declared her mother a genius. She thought of the old oak tree at the edge of the village, of every promise made and kept beneath its branches, of 312 letters that had carried her devotion across war, silence, and false reports of loss, all the way to this moment. The Duke of Ashworth, seated in a place of honor near the front of the church, watched the ceremony with an expression that had softened considerably since that first tense meeting in the receiving room. He had come, in the months since, to genuinely respect the young woman his son had chosen, recognizing in her a strength and devotion that no strategic alliance could ever have manufactured. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, and James leaned in to kiss his bride before the entire gathered village, the church erupted in cheers that seemed to carry the collective relief and joy of every person who had watched Alina's long, faithful wait finally reach its rightful end. Later that evening, as the wedding celebration continued beneath lanterns strung across the village square, not unlike the very lanterns that had lit their first meeting years before, James found a quiet moment to pull Alina aside, away from the music and laughter, toward the edge of the gathering where the old oak tree stood silent witness to everything that had unfolded beneath its branches. 312 letters, James said softly, wrapping his arms around his new wife as they stood together beneath the tree one final time as an unmarried couple's memory, now transformed into something permanent. I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain every single one of them was worth the wait. Alina smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling for the first time in years a peace that required no letters, no waiting, no uncertain hope stretched across impossible distances. She had him now, fully and completely, exactly as promised beneath this very tree so many years before. They already were, she whispered, every single one. And beneath the old oak tree, with the sounds of celebration drifting gently through the evening air, the vicar's daughter and the duke stood together at last, their long separation finally, truly over.